Welcome to the Know Your Rights Camp podcast. On today's episode, we're joined by Chandra Bhatnagar, who's our new executive director at the ACLU of Southern California, which is actually the place I've been working for about 8 years now. And Chandra just joined us this summer and brings back 2 decades of advocacy and human rights work that he's bringing to the ACLU of Southern California. So thanks for joining us, Chandra.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Cool. So tell us a little bit more about how you arrived to this work.
Sure. So I have been very fortunate to have been mentored by some amazing women, including Kimberlé Crenshaw and Angela Davis, when I was an undergraduate student. And they both helped shape the way that I look at the world and my desire to make a contribution to humanity. And I've been able to do that through organizing work, through litigation and legal advocacy, and in the federal government. And more recently, I'm honored to join the ACLU of Southern California, which has more than a century of rich history of being on the front lines for social justice and civil rights. And it's really an honor to join this incredible team, and I'm grateful to you and your colleagues for having me.
Thank you. We're so honored and so excited that you're joining us. I mean, just the 3rd executive director in 5 decades. And I remember your predecessor, Hector Villagra, who we really loved and appreciated him. I got to work with him for about 6 or 7 years. And so you have a torch that you're carrying that has been passed down for, like you said, 100 years. But this is a really unique moment we're in terms of being in Southern California, specifically Los Angeles in 2025. I mean, we were an occupied city not too long ago, right, with thousands of federal troops and even our own city government spending millions of dollars to respond to protests, peaceful protests. So how has the ACLU SoCal been responding to this, and what do you think this moment means?
Thank you for that question. And to your initial thought, I have big shoes to fill for sure. I really want to convey my appreciation and gratitude to Hector and to Ramona Ripston, who I had an opportunity to get to know when I was with ACLU National.
Wow.
And she was a force of nature, originally from Queens, I'll mention that. And she really, I had a chance to have coffee with her, and she told me a lot about what made ACLU of Southern California so groundbreaking, in that it connected the civil liberties work with the racial justice work. Mm-hmm. It connected the voting rights work with economic justice. It looked at labor organizing and farm worker work in ways that some of the other chapters just weren't ready to do. Mm-hmm. So it's always been kind of at the vanguard. And to your question, this summer, the challenges that we've all experienced and lived through, I'm proud to say that we are doing what we can to meet the moment. Mm-hmm. With regard to the ICE raids, which have devastated our city, and made folks afraid to go to the bus stop, afraid to go to 7-Eleven or to stand outside, look for work, or just to live and be part of the city. We've had an effort to work with community organizations. We have a case that we've brought against the Department of Homeland Security and ICE, challenging the legality of these ICE raids, because it's not just that they're unjust. Right. It's not just that they feel bad. They're actually unlawful. They're unconstitutional. They are violative of your rights under the 4th Amendment, the 5th Amendment, et cetera. And our view, and this is a view that we've held consistently for decades, is that no one should be afraid to live freely because of what they look like, right, or because of the language they speak, or because of who they love. Right. Any of these fundamental rights. These are fundamental human rights. Mm-hmm. And that's what we are challenging, is the denial of those rights to so many of our community members in the past, weeks and months. Mm-hmm.
And it's just been blatant in terms of some of the challenges from the federal government, specifically to Los Angeles with the mayor and different things actually California-wide, where the governor's being called out, and the state of California has had to sue the Trump administration several times already. I believe the last Trump term, the state of California sued the Trump administration over 200 times, and the ACLU sued over 400 times, and already this year we're past 50 different things. So it seems like a nonstop barrage of attacks on people's rights happening right now.
Sadly, I think your observations are accurate in that there is a lot to be done. Mm-hmm. Certainly, ACLU has a proud history of litigating, going to court to fight for our rights. I don't want to ignore, though, the other important areas of struggle. Right. We have to fight in the courts. We have to fight in the legislatures. Mm-hmm. We have to fight in the streets organizing. We have to fight in the marketplace of ideas, in the public square. We have to get ideas out there about not only what's happening, but why it's wrongheaded, why it's unlawful, why it's something that we should stand against. Because the future is ours to realize, but we have to be active participants in that resistance.
Right. Yeah. Shout out to all of our colleagues at ACLU SoCal, not just attorneys, organizers, so much staff, so many people that are leading this fight. And I mean, a lot of the work is outside of courtrooms and in communities and at the protests and on the front line and in different places.
That's such an important point, Amir, and I really want to emphasize that because the lawsuit that I mentioned brought against ICE, that was brought by farm workers. That was brought by car wash workers.
Wow.
That was brought by everyday people who have taken it upon themselves to say, we're not going to stand for this. We're going to put ourselves forward. We're going to fight for what we know to be true, our basic human dignity and human rights. And at great cost to themselves and their families, and I'm sure a lot of anxiety and dinner table conversations that you're having with your loved ones,
right.
They have put their names forward to say, no, this is not right, and I'm going to stand against it. And there's a proud history of that, as we know, right? All the great successes that have happened over the decades in advancing civil rights and human rights were based upon the courage of everyday folk. Right. Rosa Parks, the Japanese internment, you can look at folks who came forward to challenge that. There's a whole history of people who are willing to put themselves on the line because they realize that something is wrong,
right.
And that they're going to bear a disproportionate burden, but at the same time, in the future, Fred Korematsu's name will be remembered. Rosa
right.
Parks' name will be remembered, and many other folks like that.
So the ACLU, or American Civil Liberties Union, is actually a national organization that's member-based with, I believe it's over 1 million people nationwide, and here in California, over 100,000 members. I mean, I myself, before I even joined as an attorney, I was actually a member for a number of years. But how does that influence our advocacy style in terms of, organizing and working with people, whether that's in the streets or in communities?
Thank you for that question. It's a really important one because that model of having members and being accountable to those members ensures that we kind of keep our eye on the ball with regard to policies and issues that we care about. So you mentioned those two figures, more than 1 million nationally and more than 100,000 in California. Those are folks who are invested in our work. Those are folks who are supporting civil rights and civil liberties. And we're always looking for new supporters. We're always looking for people to join the fight, especially in a moment where our core rights and liberties are under threat. So it's important for us as a membership organization to be democratic, to work within our existing policy. Sometimes people ask, why do you take a position on this, but you don't take a position on that? Well, we take a position on things that are within our policy and within our membership kind of authorization. Because of that, when we do speak on behalf of an issue, it is with that microphone. It is with the microphone of all of those people who care about the First Amendment, who care about the Fourth Amendment, who care about our Constitution, and ensuring that all people are treated with basic rights and dignity at a time when those rights are really under threat.
Yeah, so shout out to all those ACLU members, whether you're getting those text alerts or emails alerts and ways to show up to events or contact your legislator, because that's what we need, those folks on the ground doing that work. And I'm also wearing one of my favorite ACLU shirts that says,
all right.
Dissent is patriotic, right? Because we tend to challenge the government, but sometimes we work with the government, right? I believe we have a case right now where it's against the federal government, but local city governments are actually joining to be a part of that. How do you balance that, as a citizen, as an American citizen, where you're the executive director of an organization that files lawsuits against the government?
So that's a great question. And what makes, I think, what is a clear guiding light for us is ensuring that everyone has their basic rights under the Constitution, under federal and state law, and under kind of principles of human rights. And when local officials are supportive of that, we will happily stand with them and bring those cases. In other circumstances, we might shine a light on an abuse that's happening at a local level, whether it's in a city or in a county or in another context. So we will stand shoulder to shoulder with those folks, sometimes who we otherwise are opponents of, when the goal is consistent and when the goal is realization of kind of fundamental rights. And that's something that we're kind of open about. And that's why we're not a political organization in the sense that we're Democrat or we're Republican or we're socialist or we're libertarian. We're consistently in favor of the Constitution and everyone being entitled to your fundamental constitutional rights. And when any of those groups are in support of that, we will stand with them. And we will protect their rights to assert their own political views. But we will always honor our core values as well.
Yeah, the ACLU has challenged the Trump administration, the Biden administration,
Obama
the
administration.
Obama administration. I say your mama administration. Anyone who's there, nonpartisan, no matter what political party, you violate the civil rights of the people, the ACLU would stand up. And I actually myself was only hired 8 years ago after the first election of Trump, where people feared for their civil liberties so much that the ACLU raised lots of money, and that's how they were able to hire attorneys like me and some others. So it's a weird balance saying I wouldn't be at the ACLU would it not had been for Trump and some of the existential threats that he brought to community, and people acknowledged it. But another thing I have in common with you is I also worked at UCLA before I came to the ACLU. I was at the Civil Rights Project there. And even though those four letters are the same, UCLA and ACLU, people respond very differently to it. Like I remember sometimes, because I was working with a research institution at UCLA, and we would request documents from, a government office or school or something, and they would be pretty quick to turn over those documents. But switch those four letters around at ACLU, they're taking months and sometimes a year where we have to challenge them to say, hey, we want these documents because it's a different kind of threat, So, yeah. So talk about a little bit of the work that you did also with ACLU National, because you worked at that affiliate before you came to.
Sure. So I was hired at ACLU National during the Bush administration. Not too long after 9/11, I was one of 3 founding members of a brand new human rights program. And that program was created to kind of shine a light on the fact that the U.S. has legal obligations, not just under the Constitution, not just under federal law and under state law, but as part of international human rights treaties that it's kind of been a party to, or just fundamental principles of international law that all countries are bound by.
Right.
For example, the prohibition against torture. Whether or not you've ratified a treaty pertaining to torture, you're still obligated to not engage in torture, right? And understanding the historical moment that the Human Rights Program was founded in, there were CIA black sites all around the world, people who were brought, accused of terrorism that were taken to undisclosed locations, who were being interrogated by the CIA and by other entities that were doing it under the direction of the CIA, or foreign governments that were doing it under the direction of the U.S. government. So challenging renditions, third-party transfers, third country transfers, challenging abuses by U.S. government entities, as well as you mentioned kind of transparency, us getting access to kind of NSA, national security actions and decisions that were made. And that continued in the Obama administration as well, in that area. So we were created to really help support all the work of the ACLU by bringing a human rights lens. And that was, it was really wonderful because it enabled me to work closely with a number of national projects, Women's Rights Project, Immigrant Rights Project, Racial Justice Project, National Security Project, among many others, and then also work with chapters and affiliates all around the country. And so I was able to have cases in Oklahoma and cases in Mississippi and in Texas and Louisiana. And so we were able to kind of have a national relationship that enabled us to support a lot of the work that was happening locally. And I will say I'm proud that program continues and that work continues even now as we're in a really challenging moment where human rights are kind of under threat.
Exactly. And you mentioned some of the project areas at ACLU, and we have some specific project areas at ACLU SoCal. And I myself, I'm part of the education equity team, but we have immigrant rights and police practices, First Amendment and free speech, which is like what people think of traditionally with ACLU, economic justice, gender and sexual reproductive justice, and many more. So let's talk about some of the past and future works of these teams and projects. And we understand the work is very intersectional, right? So sometimes there could be a case or a campaign that overlaps with immigrants' rights and police practices and First Amendment. I mean, if you look at the ICE raids and the protests, that's a clear example of where you see this interaction between different teams. And my team, we work a lot on school police or to get school police out of schools. So clearly there's overlap with the police practices team. And economic justice, I feel like everything can kind of be under that. So for example, just last night, I was on a call with a community in Inglewood, actually, where in the 8 years since I've been at ACLU, the school district has closed 40% of the schools. They went from having 15 schools to now they have about 7 or 8. And actually, this has been happening with gentrification as they build up, new stadiums. They're creating school deserts, a word that I didn't think existed. But now there are literally zip codes in Inglewood where they no longer have schools because of the level of gentrification. So that's an economic justice issue as well, and
yeah, I mean that's a really powerful point, that the ripple effects of kind of gentrification and in areas that you may not even consider it. We've seen it in the kind of context of housing, folks being priced out of neighborhoods that they were historically represented in, and being forced to move elsewhere. It's also contributed to kind of an increase in houselessness.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Where rents are so expensive, folks are now living in their cars or living on the street. And I think problems that are so holistically created have to be holistically addressed, right? And so making those connections, as you kind of articulated, between the access to education, the access to health, and food desert. Often education deserts are also food deserts, right? And so even in issue areas that are outside the scope of the ACLU, we are mindful of the importance of kind of partnering with other organizations and community organizations, for example, in Inglewood and elsewhere, that are working on those other complementary issues, right? So we're focusing on educational equity. We understand that there's a relationship between that and law enforcement and ICE and even access to kind of reproductive rights issues. And if there's lack of medical care in a particular area, and this happens in rural contexts all the time, right, where there are decisions made that will impact women that live in that area, because it's kind of a reproductive health desert, so to speak, right? So it's a really powerful point that you make, and one that has wide application, which is why the kind of concepts of fundamental rights and fundamental dignity to which all people are entitled are so powerful, and that's why I think about bringing it back to economic justice. The very last action that Dr. King was involved in before he was assassinated in 1968 was in Memphis, and he was there to support the Memphis sanitation workers who were striking.
Right.
And you will see these beautiful signs if you've watched Eyes on the Prize or any of these great documentaries. I am a man, right? That was a sign. That is a fundamental assertion of human rights. I am a person. I am entitled to dignity. We would probably have a more gender understanding sign today that we would create, one that's a little bit more representative of who we are. But that concept of asserting your personhood is one that I think is really a central theme throughout social movement history in this country and internationally as well.
Right, exactly. And we have to look at social movements as on the continuum, right? We're literally still carrying on the tradition from Dr. Martin Luther King, and actually even before that. And in Inglewood, for example, we're dealing with school closures today, but 25 years ago, ACLU filed a case against the state of California where Inglewood students only had access to 3 advanced placement courses or AP courses, compared to 6-7 miles away in Beverly Hills where they had over 45 advanced placement courses. And the system itself created these inequalities where if you're a student at a high school in Inglewood, your chances of going to a college are significantly lower just by virtue of the community that you're in. And that was 25 years ago when ACLU challenged that lawsuit. I think that was the Davis case, and versus the state of California, led to like $1 billion to try to reform this advanced placement system. But here we are, a generation later, still dealing with something that's disproportionately impacting Black and brown communities in the schools. And it's a long-term fight, so we have to make sure that we're there for the long term.
And that history, it's so important, Amir, because you see attempts to erase history in our present moment. You see books that are banned in certain states. You see efforts to rewrite the history that's in the Smithsonian Museum. It's only a matter of time till the African American History Museum gets touched.
Right.
And to whitewash the history that exists. But we can't let that happen, right? No. And we have to understand, what does it mean to live in a post-slavery, post-apartheid society?
Right.
What does it mean to live in a society that was founded on genocide? What is the long-term impact of all of that? What is the long-term impact of redlining, right, from World War II onwards, right, that even led to the initial lawsuit that you mentioned, was created because of redlining and where Black folks were relegated to because other housing opportunities were not available to them in the same way, in an equitable manner, right? So it's like inequity built on inequity built on inequity, which you can't dismantle or understand unless you're aware of that whole history going behind it, which is why it's so important for us to fight to reclaim and control that historical narrative. I feel like that even in our litigation, we have to tell those stories to the court for the court to understand why the remedy that we're proposing is required.
Right, exactly. And what do you think are some things that local governments, whether it's city, county, and others, can do to stand on the right side of history in this moment of time where there's this attack from the federal government and there's a constitutional crisis and just so many things happening as well? But what would you say to mayors or city council members who need to stand on the right side of history?
I think change starts from the bottom up. So I think in order for mayors and members of city council to have the courage to make those choices, citizens, everyday folk, citizens or non-citizens, I'm going to say people that live in our communities need to get involved in what they care about, need to partner up with an organization, whether it's the ACLU or another community organization, one that really fits your priority set. This is a time for action. You know, civil rights is not a spectator sport, you know, and for us to be able to make the sort of change that we need to make to advance rights that we've never yet realized and to protect the rights that we've already made some progress on, it's going to take all of us. It's going to take all of us to be involved in some capacity, and especially locally. You can have an impact on your city council. You really can. A small group of folks who are really committed to a particular issue can work locally in school boards, in city councils, and mayoral contexts to impact those folks and have them know there's a constituency for this. There's a constituency who cares about X issue or Y issue. So I would say get involved and figure out an issue that's dear to you and figure out folks that you can kind of sit shoulder to shoulder with and fight and plug in. And we're happy to have folks join us. We have a lot of great projects that we're working on. You mentioned many of them. And there's a whole host of information and materials that we have available as well to help people to help themselves, right? And that's really the model is give folks the information so that they can be the activists that lead the change going forward.
Exactly. I mean, that's in part why this is called the Know Your Rights Camp podcast and the initiative, because we want to help empower folks with the knowledge so they can defend and exercise their rights, you know, themselves. But as we know, unfortunately, knowledge of your rights does not guarantee respect of those rights. Right. I mean, literally, right, some of the cases we're filing now is because, you know, the government and ICE is snatching up people off the streets just because they're Latino or just other things. So we have a right to be free from those things, but violations still happen. And then that's where civil rights organizations sometimes stand in with the people. Now, what are some other things that you're seeing in this moment in time, specifically with the threats that are happening, what some people call a constitutional crisis where court orders are being ignored, or the retaliation that's happening at the federal level where people speak up, they're going after them personally, whether it's politicians or entire organizations.
Students.
Or students, yeah, we know.
Right, student visas.
Yes.
I mean, it is shocking that a government would be so threatened by a student writing an op-ed in their school paper expressing any view whatsoever that they should lose their student visa over that.
Sounds like it's not a free country to me.
I mean, that is the definition of kind of your denial of your First Amendment rights, where you're literally putting something into the public square to say, hey, here's an idea I have. Whatever the idea is, right? Here's an idea I have. Oh, well, because of that idea, you're going to be punished by the government. That's, you know, that can't be. We know that that's not consistent with what the Constitution requires. And to your broader point, I think this is a moment where we have to really, I mean, Know Your Rights Camp, it couldn't be more important than right now. Because yes, it's true that even if you know your rights, those rights can be violated. But if you're not aware of what those rights are in the first place, you don't have a prayer.
Right.
Like, you really don't. And so part of what it is knowing your rights. Part of what it is working collectively with others to exercise those rights, and then documenting when those rights are denied. So what was so powerful about the way that Los Angeles has kind of resisted the ICE raids and other actions is the courage of everyday people to document, right? To use your phone to document. Some of the stuff that we've seen has been because people have taken their phones out and documented it or told the stories about what's happened. And We know it's racial profiling, right? There are U.S. citizens with brown skin that are being rounded up and held in detention until they can prove that they're citizens. So what else is it? Why else are you being rounded up? Not because you did anything wrong, but because of what this is, right? So that documentation is a really powerful tool. And supporting others, working with others when you see that they've been wronged or they've been harmed is another powerful tool, kind of allyship. And it's not just immigrant communities. You see LGBTQIA communities, particularly trans youth that are being viciously targeted by this administration. And this is an opportunity for us to stand in solidarity on those issues with those kids and be like, we got your back. We're here for you. What do you need us to do? Right? To take direction from them, but to also amplify those voices so that they can speak on their own behalf. If you look historically, part of what I think is so valuable about the Know Your Rights Camp and the work that you all are doing here is around the world. One of my favorite quotes from the great Malcolm X was, of all sciences, history is best qualified to reward all research because you cannot know where you're going unless you know where you've been. So you look at history, you look at world history. Who has led every social movement around the world? Young people. Who has put their bodies on the line? Who has had the energy and the vision and the organizing? Not to say other folks have not, been involved. Of course, they have. But young people have been a key component. And they bring energy and culture and music and art and poetry, all that stuff together. So I think it's really important that young people are activated, are empowered with knowledge and tools, and then decide how they want to drive the bus, have an opportunity to lead and have an opportunity to make change. And this is a moment for young people to do that, to really stand up and decide, what kind of future do you want to have? What kind of world do you want to live in? What kind of planet do you want to live in with, all the kind of planetary challenges that we're also confronting from a kind of climate change standpoint. So I'm excited because I see a lot of really visionary young people rising to the challenge. And I really want to make sure that all of our communities are given the tools to kind of be their own advocates and their own champions of change.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely inspired and motivated by the work you're seeing from this next generation coming up. One of the proudest things I've been able to do at ACLU SoCal is help start our Youth Liberty Squad, where we've had students at this point from probably over 70 different schools across Southern California, hundreds of students total. Many of them are at Columbia and UCLA and these other universities where they've been protesting and different things. And luckily, we've empowered some of them with rights, knowledge of their rights and First Amendment and other things. But I'm always inspired by what they're doing at their own school. You can see a high school senior gathering 100 petitions to create an arts class, or, students organizing a Stop Asian Hate protest in their community and other stuff we've been able to bear witness to with that young generation. So it's really an honor. Here in California, we have some protections in the governor that's been willing to stand down, against attacks and threaten or welcome the threats. I believe the Trump administration threatened to arrest our governor, and he responded with something I can't say on this podcast right now, right? But other states, especially those with Republican governors, you see a different type of collaboration, and many people feel like there's something brewing at the federal level. There's, like, for example, what's happening right now in Washington, D.C., where they're trying to send the National Guard and other troops there armed to do policing and other things. What do you see happening at the federal level? Or what's your sense of what's going on right now?
That's a terrific question. There's a lot of pieces to this. So I'm going to break it apart in two different ways. Firstly, from an architecture standpoint, one of the things that has been maybe not as well covered because there are so many crises that are competing for kind of the attention of all of us right now is the dismantling of the civil rights apparatus that was built in the wake of the civil rights movement.
Right.
So we mentioned previously Dr. King and his assassination. One of the great pieces of legislation that Dr. King helped to champion was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right, which created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which outlawed employment discrimination nationally, and had a number of other significant civil rights impacts. And what we've seen over 8 months in this administration is a threat to abolish the Department of Education,
right,
which would have a devastating impact on students with disabilities, on students of color, particularly black and brown students, and students in rural areas, frankly, areas where resources are less. And the creation of the Department of Education was one of the impacts of the civil rights movement, right? We've seen the EEOC, which has historically been an anti-discrimination watchdog that was free from the politics of any administration. We've seen it become political and take positions on issues that it historically did not. It historically championed the civil rights of trans people to be free from employment discrimination. It traditionally took disparate impact as a important legal theory that needs to exist to combat employment discrimination, which courts have reaffirmed over decades.
Right.
And it's now taking contrary positions. Additionally, the Department of Labor and the Department of Justice have changed their patterns and behaviors. So notably, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division dropped.
Yeah, they still exist, right?
I mean, they still exist, but they're not doing the work that they were supposed to be doing. They were not doing the work that they've historically done under both Democratic and Republican administrations, where you're monitoring consent decrees with police departments, where you're engaging in, kind of anti-discrimination work, which is at the core of your raison d'etre. Like, why do you exist? So the Civil Rights Division at DOJ is not doing what it's historically done. And all of the apparatuses of the federal government to combat discrimination are not operating as though they have historically, how they have historically. So that architecture piece is really important. Secondly, you have specific attacks on discrete populations. And part of that is by attacking history. We mentioned that, book bans in Florida, book bans in other states, and attempts to kind of change the museums and demonize particular communities, right? Whether it's the trans community, whether it is immigrant communities, the unhoused, and black communities, right? You're seeing the rationale for whatever is happening in D.C. to be, it's a problem of unhoused people, or it's a problem of crime, or it's a problem of, immigrants out of control, and we're going to come in and take control.
Right.
And it's a manufactured crisis. Just like in LA, it's a completely manufactured crisis. There's no reason whatsoever for the federal government to be involved in policing in Washington, D.C. or in Los Angeles. It's completely unnecessary. It's a manufactured crisis to justify federal imposition and denial of kind of fundamental rights to the local populations. And that's what we are watching very closely. And I think there's, already kind of legal actions that are being taken to address. But if there's any message I would convey to the kind of viewing audience here, we cannot normalize this stuff. We cannot look the other way. I love sports. I'm going to be playing fantasy football this fall.
All right.
I like music. I like entertainment. There's a time for us to have outside interests that's not work. Absolutely. But we cannot allow all of that to distract us from what is happening in front of our eyes and act like this is the new normal.
Right.
Like we're just going to sit by and let this happen. We all have different contributions to make. Maybe we are an artist or a poet. Maybe we're a graphic designer. Maybe whatever you do, there's some way that you can make a contribution towards ensuring that we get back on a path towards justice as opposed to where we're headed right now. So I would say to everybody, figure out how you can make a contribution and use that. But this is a time for action.
It most certainly is. And I definitely have seen that and felt that people feel like it's not much you can do, and headline after headline, day after day, there's all these attacks on basic things, people losing access to Medicare, people losing access to civil rights protections. And it can make you hopeless, but just know folks like you are still out here in the fight, right? And
folks like you.
folks like I, and we are with the people. We're working with the people, right? ACLU is a members-based organization, and we're accountable to that. So one of the last questions I want to ask you is just before we share more about how people can get in touch with the ACLU and plug in and tap in, what are some of your most, I don't want to say favorite because you don't have to choose favorite, but just some of the most impactful ACLU cases throughout the 100-year history? And I'll just list a few right now that folks may not be aware of, but several cases that have gone up to the Supreme Court that impact the rights of all Americans have been litigated and fought by the ACLU. whether that's Roe versus Wade in 1973, right, protecting the right for women to choose their body, the Miranda case in 1966, the Miranda rights, the right to remain silent, the Gideon case to ensure a right to court-appointed counsel for defendants and others, the Loving v. Virginia case in 1967, which had to overturn the ban on interracial marriage, which people don't know that there were states and areas in this country where it was illegal to intermarry. And there are literally legislators right now that are trying to bring back things like this. So there's so many cases, but what do you think have been some of the ones that stuck out to you?
You know, I want to zoom in on the Loving case that you mentioned for a couple reasons. Firstly, the attack on marriage equality and the attempts to roll back the clock on the rights of LGBTQ people. We are seeing that in a concerted way.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not too long ago that the Supreme Court said everyone has a right to marry because you're a human being. You know, I'm paraphrasing, but that's how I would have written it. We cannot backslide. We cannot backslide into a time when folks are not allowed to live as their authentic selves, are not allowed to choose who they love. If you are someone who believes in limited government, quote unquote, if you're someone who's a conservative in terms of a libertarian, or you think the government should only do a certain amount of things, this is an area where really the government has no business being.
Right.
The people's bedrooms. It really doesn't. And so I think those threats are very real. And I heard an interview with the governor of Indiana, maybe it was the day before yesterday or it was sometime recently, where he said that he thought that the question of interracial marriage should come back to the states.
That's the one I was referring to, yeah.
So this is the governor of a state that thought that issue, which was, settled in the 1960s, should be returned to the states. That is alarming, that any public official, let alone a governor of any state, would have that view in 2025.
Right.
I mean, what are we talking about? Interracial marriage? Like, it's hard to even speak it because it seems so absurd, but the rationale attacking, and this is where I think we can draw connections between Black communities, brown communities, LGBTQ communities, and of course there's overlapping folks in all these communities, but the attacks on all of us, the attacks on these fundamental rights are impacting everybody. When we talk about the ICE raids in Los Angeles, that has disproportionately been Latino communities that have been impacted, but there are a lot of Black immigrants in LA and in other cities as well.
Exactly.
In New York City, the Haitian community has been impacted and has resisted. And we need to shine a light on that so that we understand the diversity within all of our communities. We understand the power that we have when we work collectively in partnership. And that to me is a kind of recipe for resistance.
Nice. So in conclusion, just want to let our users know that no matter what state you're in, if you're in the 50 states or in Puerto Rico, you can tap into the ACLU's work at www.aclu.org. But Chandra and I are at the ACLU SoCal, where we have a website, www.aclusocal.org. But no matter what state or locality you're in, you can find ways to tap in and get involved. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Know Your Rights Camp podcast. Be sure to follow us on social media and learn more at www.knowyourrightscamp.org.